While European nobles were eating off wooden plates and relieving themselves in castle courtyards, there was a city in Africa where scholars debated philosophy in marble halls, and gold was so abundant that the emperor literally gave it away to strangers on the street. A city so wealthy that when its ruler went on vacation, he accidentally crashed the entire Mediterranean economy for a decade. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true story of Timbuktu and the Mali Empire, a civilization so advanced and prosperous that it would make today's billionaires look like paupers. But here's what they don't want you to know. This empire's downfall wasn't caused by war or natural disaster. It was something far more sinister. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was buried from history books for centuries. Our story begins in the 13th century, in the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River bends like a golden serpent through the Sahara Desert. Here, at this crucial crossroads between the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa, a small trading post called Timbuktu was about to become the center of the wealthiest empire the medieval world had ever seen. But to understand how Timbuktu became the richest city on earth, we need to go back to the beginning, to a legend so incredible that even today, historians debate whether it really happened or if it's simply the most successful propaganda campaign in African history. The year was 1235. Across West Africa, dozens of small kingdoms and tribal confederations were locked in constant warfare, fighting over control of the region's most precious resources, gold, salt, and the trade routes that connected them. Into this chaos stepped a man whose very name would strike fear into the hearts of enemies and inspire legends that would echo through centuries. Sundiata Keita, the Lion King of Mali. But Sundiata's rise to power began with what appeared to be a devastating defeat. As a young prince, he was crippled from birth, unable to walk until his teenage years. His own people mocked him as weak, unsuitable for leadership. When his kingdom was conquered by the sorcerer King Sumanguru, Sundiata was forced into exile, wandering from court to court, begging for shelter and protection. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical. During his years in exile, Sundiata didn't just survive, he learned. He studied the military tactics of different peoples, mastered the art of diplomacy, and most importantly, he began to understand something that would revolutionize African politics: the power of unity over division. When Sundiata finally returned to challenge Sumanguru in 1235, he didn't come back as a single warrior seeking revenge. He came back as the leader of a coalition that included dozens of previously rival tribes, all united under a revolutionary concept: the Mandan Charter, perhaps the world's first written constitution. The Battle of Kirina, where Sundiata defeated Sumanguru, wasn't just a military victory. It was the birth of a new kind of African state. The Mandan Charter established principles that were centuries ahead of their time: protection for women and children during warfare, environmental conservation laws, and most remarkably, a system of social organization that balanced individual rights with collective responsibility. But what made Sundiata's empire different wasn't just military conquest or political innovation. Sundiata understood something that European rulers of his time couldn't grasp. True power came not from oppressing your people, but from creating systems that made everyone prosper. Imagine standing on the banks of the Niger River in the year 1250, just 15 years after Sundiata's victory. To your north, the Sahara Desert stretches endlessly, but this isn't the barren wasteland many imagine. Hidden beneath its sands lie some of the richest salt mines in the world. Mines so valuable that a pound of salt could literally be traded for a pound of gold. The town of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, was essentially a city built entirely of salt. The houses were made of salt blocks, the streets were paved with salt, even the furniture was carved from solid salt. Slaves worked in these mines under conditions so harsh that few survived more than a few years. But the profits were so enormous that merchants considered this an acceptable cost of doing business. To your south, in the regions of Bambouk and Bouré, rivers carry gold dust like glittering promises downstream. But here's the fascinating part. The people of Mali didn't just stumble upon these resources. They built an entire civilization around controlling and refining them. The Malian miners had developed techniques for extracting gold that were so advanced they wouldn't be surpassed until the Industrial Revolution. They created underground networks that stretched for hundreds of miles with ventilation systems that kept miners safe at depths that would challenge modern equipment. They had developed techniques for separating gold from sand and gravel that were more efficient than anything used in medieval Europe. But perhaps most ingeniously, they had solved the fundamental problem of medieval mining: how to extract valuable resources without destroying the environment that sustained local communities. Malian gold mines operated on rotation systems that allowed the land to recover between mining seasons. They developed techniques for processing ore that minimized water pollution. They even had early forms of what we would now call environmental impact assessments. The result was sustainable prosperity on a scale that medieval Europe couldn't imagine. While European mines were typically exhausted within a generation, Mali's gold mines produced consistently for centuries. But gold and salt were just the beginning. The real genius of the Mali Empire lay in understanding that wealth without knowledge is temporary, but knowledge without wealth is powerless. And this is where Timbuktu enters our story. Around 1100 CE, long before Mali's golden age, Timbuktu began as nothing more than a seasonal camp for Tuareg nomads. The name itself comes from Tin Abutut, meaning the place of Abutut, named after an old woman who was left to guard the camp's well while the men traveled with their herds across the desert. Picture this elderly Tuareg woman sitting beside a simple well in the middle of nowhere, waiting for her people to return from their seasonal migrations. She had no idea that this humble well would become the foundation of one of the most magnificent cities in the medieval world. The location was perfect by accident. Timbuktu sat at the point where the Niger River comes closest to the Sahara Desert, the natural meeting place between the boat-using peoples of the river and the camel-using peoples of the desert. It was where two completely different worlds of trade and culture intersected. By 1200, what had started as a simple well had grown into a small trading post. Merchants from the south would arrive by boat, carrying gold, ivory, and slaves. Merchants from the north would arrive by camel caravan, carrying salt, horses, and manufactured goods from North Africa and the Mediterranean. But what transformed Timbuktu from a simple trading post into something unprecedented was Sundiata's vision of what a city could become. When the Mali Empire incorporated Timbuktu around 1240, Sundiata didn't just want to control the trade that passed through the city. He wanted to create something that had never existed in sub-Saharan Africa, a center of learning that could rival the great cities of the Islamic world. What started as pragmatic policy became revolutionary vision. Sundiata began offering protection and incentives to scholars, teachers, and craftsmen who would settle in Timbuktu. He established the first libraries, the first schools, the first institutions that would make knowledge, not just trade, the foundation of urban prosperity. By 1300, under Mali's protection and patronage, Timbuktu had become a magnet for scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the known world. The city's population swelled to over 100,000 residents, making it larger than London or Paris at the time. But here's what made Timbuktu truly extraordinary. It wasn't just wealthy, it was intellectually sophisticated in ways that would shame many modern cities. The University of Sankore, which began as a simple mosque school, had grown into an institution that housed over 700,000 manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy and mathematics to philosophy and Islamic jurisprudence. What Sundiata and his successors created in Mali wasn't just a kingdom, it was an economic system so sophisticated that it wouldn't be matched in complexity until the modern era. While European economies were still largely based on subsistence agriculture and local barter, Mali had developed something that resembled a modern market economy. The empire operated on multiple currencies simultaneously. Gold dust was used for large transactions and international trade. Cowrie shells imported from the Indian Ocean served as small change for daily purchases. Salt bars functioned as a store of value for medium-term savings. And most remarkably, Mali had developed a credit system that allowed merchants to operate across thousands of miles without carrying physical wealth. Here's how it worked. A merchant in Timbuktu could deposit gold with a trusted banker and receive a letter of credit. That letter could be taken to Cairo, Damascus, or Mecca and exchanged for local currency at a predetermined rate. This system, which wouldn't appear in Europe for another 2 centuries, made long-distance trade both safer and more profitable. But the real innovation was in taxation and economic policy. Instead of simply extracting wealth from conquered territories, Mali's rulers created a system where prosperity in one region automatically benefited all others. Trade routes were protected by imperial armies, standardized weights and measures eliminated fraud, and most importantly, local rulers were incentivized to maximize economic growth rather than simply extract tribute. The result was what economists today would recognize as a positive feedback loop. Increased trade generated more tax revenue, which funded better infrastructure and security, which attracted more merchants, which increased trade even further. By 1300, Mali was generating wealth equivalent to billions of dollars in today's money annually. The empire's treasury was so full that chroniclers reported seeing rooms in the royal palace that were literally filled with gold dust, stored like grain in enormous earthenware jars. But all of this prosperity, all of this knowledge, all of this sophisticated economic and political achievement was about to be concentrated in the hands of one man whose wealth would become so legendary that European cartographers would draw him on their maps simply holding a golden orb. A man whose single journey would change the course of world history and reveal to medieval Europe that there was a civilization in Africa that made their kingdoms look like villages. That man was Mansa Musa, and what he inherited when he took the throne in 1312 was an empire so wealthy that even he didn't fully understand its true power. When Mansa Musa ascended to the throne of Mali around 1312, he inherited more than just a kingdom. He inherited a gold-producing machine that generated wealth at a rate that would make modern oil barons weep with envy. But who was this man who would become known as the richest human being who ever lived? Musa's full title was Mansa, meaning King of Kings. But even this grand title fails to capture the scope of his power. He ruled over an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, an area larger than all of Western Europe combined. His domain included parts of what we now call Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Ivory Coast. But Musa wasn't just geographically powerful. He was intellectually formidable in ways that set him apart from most medieval rulers. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who spoke multiple languages fluently, Arabic for international diplomacy, various local African languages for governing his diverse empire, and he had enough knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to engage with scholars as an intellectual equal, not just a patron. Unlike many medieval kings who relied entirely on advisors, Musa was personally involved in the complex details of governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that spanned vast distances. He had developed a communication system using relay stations and mounted messengers that could carry messages from Timbuktu to the Atlantic coast in less than 2 weeks, faster than most European kingdoms could communicate across much smaller distances. But here's what made Musa truly remarkable. In an age when European kings were constantly at war with their neighbors, fighting over scraps of territory and meager resources, Musa had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had created sustainable peace and prosperity across a continent-spanning empire. How did he do it? The answer reveals a level of political sophistication that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. The Mali Empire under Mansa Musa wasn't just wealthy by accident. It was the result of one of the most sophisticated governmental systems the medieval world had ever seen. While European feudalism created a patchwork of competing loyalties and constant conflict, Musa had developed a centralized system that balanced local autonomy with imperial unity. The empire was divided into 12 provinces, each governed by appointed governors who answered directly to Musa. But here's the genius. These weren't hereditary positions handed out to nobles based on birth or family connections. They were merit-based appointments, often given to individuals who had proven their competence in trade, scholarship, or administration. Each governor was supported by a sophisticated bureaucracy that included tax collectors, military commanders, judges, and what we would now call economic development officers. These officials were rotated regularly to prevent corruption and the development of local power bases that might challenge imperial authority. But Musa's real innovation was in creating a system of checks and balances that prevented any single person or group from accumulating too much power. Provincial governors controlled civil administration but not military forces. Military commanders controlled armies but not tax collection. Religious leaders had spiritual authority but limited political power. Each province specialized in what it did best, but within a coordinated imperial strategy. The northern regions focused on salt mining and Trans-Saharan trade, developing relationships with North African and Middle Eastern merchants. The southern regions concentrated on gold mining and agriculture, but also served as buffer zones against potential threats from forest kingdoms further south. The central regions, including Timbuktu, became centers of learning and commerce where all these wealth streams converged. But Musa's real masterstroke was in taxation and monetary policy. Instead of simply extracting wealth from his territories, he created a system where prosperity in one region automatically benefited all others. Trade routes were protected by imperial armies funded by customs duties. Standardized weights and measures eliminated fraud and increased trading efficiency. A sophisticated credit system allowed merchants to operate across thousands of miles without carrying physical gold. The result? By 1320, Mali was generating wealth equivalent to billions of dollars in today's money annually. Contemporary Arab chroniclers reported that the empire's treasury was so full that Musa literally didn't know what to do with all the gold. But this enormous wealth came with a problem that no medieval ruler had ever faced before. How do you spend so much money that your spending doesn't destroy your own economy through inflation? Here's something that most people don't understand about Mansa Musa's legendary wealth. It wasn't just large in absolute terms, it was large relative to the entire medieval world economy. Economists today estimate that at its peak, Mali controlled between 10–15% of the world's gold supply. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to a single modern nation controlling 10–15% of global oil production. This created unprecedented economic challenges. If Musa spent too much gold within his own empire, he would trigger massive inflation that would hurt his own people. If he hoarded the gold, it couldn't generate the economic activity needed to maintain the empire's prosperity. If he traded too much gold internationally, he risked flooding global markets and destroying the value of his own reserves. Musa's solution was brilliant. He developed what we would now call economic diplomacy. Instead of just buying and selling goods, Mali began using its wealth strategically to build political relationships, fund infrastructure projects, and support institutions that would increase the empire's long-term power and influence. For example, Musa funded the construction of mosques and schools not just in Mali, but throughout the Islamic world. This wasn't just religious charity. It was a calculated investment in soft power that created networks of influence stretching from Spain to India. He also began what we would now call foreign aid programs, providing financial support to allied rulers and communities throughout West and North Africa. This created a web of political relationships that made Mali not just wealthy, but diplomatically influential on a scale that rivaled the great empires of the Mediterranean and Middle East. But perhaps most importantly, Musa invested heavily in what economists today would call human capital: education, training, and knowledge development. The expansion of Timbuktu's University of Sankore wasn't just about preserving books. It was about creating a pool of educated administrators, diplomats, merchants, and technical specialists who could manage an increasingly complex empire. By 1320, Mali had more university-educated administrators per capita than most European kingdoms. The empire's diplomatic corps could conduct negotiations in Arabic, various African languages, and even some European languages. Malian merchants were operating successfully in markets from Lisbon to Beijing. But all of this success, all of this sophisticated economic and political achievement was about to be put to the ultimate test. Because as a devout Muslim, Mansa Musa was obligated to undertake a pilgrimage that would risk everything he had built in a single, unprecedented gamble. This brings us to 1324 and the decision that would make Mansa Musa's name immortal. As a devout Muslim, Musa was obligated to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his lifetime. For most medieval rulers, this would have been a modest affair, a small entourage, a few months' journey, and a quiet fulfillment of religious duty. But Mansa Musa wasn't most medieval rulers. Here's what we need to understand about medieval pilgrimage. It wasn't just a religious obligation, it was also a diplomatic opportunity. The Hajj brought together Muslims from across the known world, rulers, merchants, scholars, and common believers from Spain to Indonesia. For a medieval king, it was the ultimate networking event. But Musa saw something more. He understood that Mali's wealth and sophistication were still largely unknown outside of West Africa. Arab chroniclers knew that gold came from somewhere south of the Sahara, but they had no clear understanding of the political and economic systems that produced this wealth. What Musa planned wasn't just a pilgrimage. It was a demonstration of power that would announce to the world that Africa contained an empire that rivaled anything in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. It was going to be the most expensive publicity campaign in medieval history. But even he couldn't have predicted what his journey would unleash. The preparation alone took 2 years and involved logistics that would challenge a modern government. Musa needed to maintain security and stability across his empire while he was absent for over a year. He needed to organize supplies and accommodations for a massive traveling party. Most challenging of all, he needed to calculate exactly how much wealth to take with him. Enough to make an impression, but not so much that he destabilized his own economy. The final caravan that assembled in 1324 was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Musa brought 60,000 people, including 12,000 slaves dressed in fine silk and carrying golden staffs. But here's the detail that reveals the true scale of Mali's wealth. Each of the 80 camels in the caravan carried 300 pounds of gold dust. Do the math. That's 24,000 pounds of gold, worth over $600 million in today's currency. And that was just the gold they were carrying as spending money for the journey. But the caravan also included something even more valuable than gold. It included some of the finest scholars, craftsmen, and artists from across the Mali Empire. Musa was bringing not just wealth, but proof of Mali's intellectual and cultural sophistication. When Musa's caravan finally set out from Mali in 1324, nobody, not even the emperor himself, could have predicted that this religious pilgrimage would accidentally become the most devastating economic attack on the Mediterranean world that had ever been launched. What happened next would crash entire economies, rewrite trade routes, and reveal to medieval Europe that everything they thought they knew about Africa was completely wrong. But the real shock wasn't just the wealth Musa displayed. It was what he learned during his journey that would change everything. Picture the scene. It's early 1324, and across the Sahara Desert, a golden river of humanity is flowing eastward toward Mecca. At the head of this procession rides Mansa Musa, but what follows him defies all medieval understanding of wealth and power. The caravan stretched for miles across the desert landscape. Contemporary Arab chroniclers who witnessed it describe something that belonged more in legend than reality. Al-Umari, writing in Damascus, said that the dust kicked up by 60,000 people, and their animals could be seen from the horizon, and the glint of gold from the caravan's equipment was visible from miles away. But let's break down exactly what this caravan represented. The 60,000 people weren't just random travelers. They were a cross-section of Mali's entire society, carefully selected to demonstrate the empire's sophistication. There were scholars from Timbuktu's University of Senghor, carrying with them some of the finest manuscripts in the Islamic world. There were master craftsmen, goldsmiths, leather workers, architects, and textile specialists who would demonstrate Malian technical skills wherever they stopped. There were also 12,000 slaves, but these weren't ordinary slaves. They were dressed in fine silk and brocade, carried golden staffs, and many of them were skilled artisans or educated administrators who would normally have been considered valuable members of society anywhere else in the world. Musa was essentially displaying human capital the way other rulers might display military might. The caravan's animals were equally impressive. The 80 camels carrying gold were just part of a much larger herd that included riding camels, pack animals, and dairy camels to provide fresh milk during the journey. The horses in the caravan were Arabian purebreds, animals so valuable that European knights would have considered them worth a fortune by themselves. But the true spectacle wasn't just the size of the entourage. It was the casual, almost careless way that unimaginable wealth was displayed. Servants carried umbrellas made of silk and adorned with golden birds. The emperor's personal tent was constructed from precious metals and could house 1,000 people for ceremonial receptions. Even the horses were shod with gold instead of iron, not because iron wasn't available, but because gold was so abundant that using it for horseshoes was considered a reasonable way to demonstrate wealth. The caravan moved at a stately pace, about 15 miles per day, not because they couldn't move faster, but because Musa was conducting imperial business along the way. This wasn't just a pilgrimage, it was a royal progress through foreign lands, designed to demonstrate that Mali's power extended far beyond Africa's borders. At every stop, Musa would hold court, receiving local rulers and merchants, conducting diplomatic negotiations, and gathering intelligence about political and economic conditions throughout North Africa and the Middle East. By the time the caravan reached Cairo, Musa probably knew more about the Mediterranean world's political situation than most of the region's actual rulers. The caravan's first major stop was Cairo, then the largest city in the world outside of China, and the economic heart of Mediterranean trade. The Cairo that Mansa Musa entered in July 1324 was already one of the wealthiest cities on earth, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. When Musa's procession entered the city, the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Hassan expected to receive a wealthy African king, paying the customary tribute expected from foreign rulers. What the Sultan didn't expect was to meet someone who might actually be wealthier than he was. The initial meeting between Musa and the Sultan became the stuff of legend, but not for the reasons you might expect. According to protocol, foreign rulers were expected to prostrate themselves before the Sultan as a sign of respect and submission. Musa refused. His reasoning was both diplomatic and theological. As a fellow Muslim ruler, he owed no allegiance to earthly princes, only to Allah. This was unprecedented. No foreign ruler had ever dared to claim equality with a Mamluk Sultan in his own capital. The court was shocked. Some advisors urged the Sultan to treat this as an insult worthy of military response. But then Musa did something that left the entire court speechless. As a gesture of goodwill, he began distributing gold to everyone he met. Not small gifts, massive quantities of pure gold, handed out as casually as a modern politician might distribute campaign buttons. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound almost fantastical. Musa giving away so much gold to random courtiers that some of them became wealthy enough to never work again. He purchased goods in Cairo's markets by paying in gold dust, often paying 10 times the asking price simply because he couldn't be bothered to negotiate. When he visited the city's mosques, he would leave donations so large that the religious authorities didn't know what to do with them. When he toured Cairo's famous markets, he would buy entire inventories of goods, not because he needed them, but simply to demonstrate that he could afford them. But here's the detail that reveals just how wealthy Musa really was. After giving away enormous quantities of gold for weeks, he actually ran low on spending money. So he borrowed gold from Cairo's merchants at interest rates of 20–30% and paid back the loans immediately, essentially paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money just to have pocket cash for the rest of his stay. The immediate effect was inflation on a scale that medieval Cairo had never experienced. Within weeks, the price of goods in the city's markets had increased by 20%, but this was only the beginning. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Musa spent 3 months in Cairo, and during that time, he distributed so much gold that he single-handedly destabilized the precious metals market across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Medieval economies were based on the relative scarcity of gold and silver. The sudden injection of massive quantities of pure gold into Cairo's markets didn't just cause inflation, it fundamentally altered the balance of trade across the known world. Egyptian merchants, suddenly flush with Malian gold, began purchasing goods from European and Asian traders at prices that made no economic sense. Venetian merchants, arriving at Alexandria with their usual cargoes of European textiles and manufactured goods, found that Egyptian buyers were offering to pay in gold at rates that were double or triple the normal exchange rates. This caused a chain reaction that rippled across the Mediterranean. Venice's merchant fleets returned from Alexandria with holds full of gold, which they then used to purchase goods in Constantinople, Genoa, and other European markets. European traders, trying to understand where this wealth was coming from, began to realize that there was a source of gold in Africa that dwarfed anything they had imagined. But the real shock came when European merchants tried to trace the source of this gold back to its origin. The Arab merchants they dealt with in Cairo knew that the gold came from a place called Mali, somewhere south of the Sahara, but they had only vague understanding of the political and economic systems that produced this wealth. For the first time, European traders began to understand that there was an African empire that might be wealthier than any European kingdom. Maps began to be redrawn. Trading companies began to plan expeditions. The balance of medieval geopolitics was shifting. But Musa's economic impact was just beginning. When he left Cairo and continued toward Mecca, the gold he had distributed began to flow through medieval trade networks like a golden tsunami. Arab merchants used Malian gold to purchase spices and silk from Asian traders. These Asian goods were then sold to European merchants who paid for them with silver, which was then used to purchase more African gold. The result was a complete restructuring of international trade relationships that would persist for decades. When Mansa Musa finally reached Mecca in October 1324, he had already achieved something unprecedented. He had announced to the Islamic world that a new power had emerged in Africa. But what happened in Mecca itself was even more significant for the future of Mali and Timbuktu. During the Hajj rituals, Musa met with scholars, merchants, and rulers from across the Islamic world. These weren't just ceremonial meetings. They were intensive intelligence gathering sessions that would reshape Mali's relationship with the broader world. From Persian merchants, Musa learned about new mining techniques that could increase gold production while reducing environmental damage. From Syrian architects, he learned about construction methods that could create larger, more durable buildings in desert climates. From Egyptian scholars, he learned about new developments in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine that could benefit Timbuktu's growing university. But most importantly, Musa learned about new financial instruments and trading practices that would allow Mali to engage directly with Asian markets without relying on North African intermediaries. He discovered that there were sea routes connecting the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic that could potentially allow Mali to trade directly with India, China, and Southeast Asia. The most significant meeting was with Ibn Battuta, the great medieval traveler, who was so impressed by Musa's knowledge and wealth that he decided to visit Mali personally. When Ibn Battuta eventually reached Timbuktu in 1353, his written account would provide the world with the first detailed description of Mali's extraordinary civilization. But Musa also learned some disturbing information during his time in Mecca. Portuguese explorers were already pushing down the Atlantic coast of Africa, clearly searching for a sea route to the sources of African gold. The Ottoman Empire was expanding westward, potentially threatening the northern terminals of the trade routes that were the foundation of Mali's prosperity. Most ominously, Musa learned that European merchants and rulers were beginning to ask detailed questions about Mali's military capabilities, political structure, and potential vulnerabilities. The empire's wealth had made it famous, but fame could be dangerous if it attracted the wrong kind of attention. When Musa began his return journey to Mali in 1325, he was carrying more than just new knowledge and diplomatic connections. He was carrying a terrible understanding. By revealing Mali's wealth so dramatically, he had also revealed its vulnerabilities. The empire that had prospered in relative isolation was now on everyone's map, literally and figuratively, and what he did when he returned to Timbuktu would determine whether Mali's golden age would continue or whether it had just signed its own death warrant. When Mansa Musa's caravan finally appeared on the horizon outside Timbuktu in early 1326, the city's residents witnessed something unprecedented in African history: the return of a ruler who had become an international celebrity. Word of Musa's spectacular pilgrimage had traveled back to Mali through trade networks, and the entire empire was buzzing with stories of their emperor's legendary generosity and the impression he had made on the Islamic world. But Musa returned as a changed man. The provincial African king, who had left Mali 2 years earlier, had been replaced by a sophisticated international statesman who understood both the opportunities and the dangers that Mali's newfound fame had created. Musa brought with him more than just stories and souvenirs. He had recruited some of the finest architects, scholars, and craftsmen from the Islamic world, offering them salaries that no European court could match. Among them was Es-Saheli, the Andalusian architect who would transform Timbuktu's skyline, and dozens of scholars who would make the University of Sankore into one of the world's great centers of learning. But perhaps most importantly, Musa brought with him a new vision of what Timbuktu could become. During his travels, he had seen the great cities of Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca. He had witnessed firsthand the power that came from combining wealth, knowledge, and architectural magnificence. He was determined to create something in Timbuktu that would rival the greatest cities of the Islamic world. What followed was one of the most remarkable urban transformations in medieval history. The Timbuktu that Mansa Musa began reshaping in 1326 was already impressive by African standards, but it was still recognizably a desert trading post. The Timbuktu that emerged over the next decade was something entirely different, a city that could legitimately claim to be one of the most advanced urban centers in the world. Musa's first priority was architecture. The Great Mosque of Timbuktu, designed by Es-Saheli, wasn't just a religious building. It was a statement of architectural sophistication that incorporated techniques from Islamic Spain, Fatimid Egypt, and local African traditions. The mosque's distinctive pyramidal minarets became the iconic silhouette that would define Timbuktu's skyline for centuries. But Es-Saheli's masterpiece was Musa's new palace complex, which covered over 12 acres in the heart of the city. The palace wasn't just a residence, it was a statement of imperial power, designed to impress foreign ambassadors and demonstrate that Mali could create architectural wonders that rivaled anything in Cairo or Baghdad. The palace complex included reception halls that could accommodate thousands of guests, libraries that housed tens of thousands of manuscripts, workshops where master craftsmen created goods for international trade, and residential quarters for the hundreds of scholars, administrators, and specialists who managed the empire's affairs. But the real jewel was the expansion of the University of Sankore. Musa invested what would be millions of dollars in today's currency to create a center of learning that attracted scholars from as far away as Central Asia and Islamic Spain. Here's what made Sankore truly extraordinary. It wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was creating new knowledge. The university operated more like a modern research institution than a medieval school. Scholars didn't just teach and copy existing texts. They conducted original research, engaged in scholarly debates, and created new works that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. Sankore's astronomers created star charts that were more accurate than anything available in Europe. They calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable precision, developed new techniques for navigation that were essential for Trans-Saharan trade, and even created primitive astronomical instruments that could predict eclipses and planetary movements. The university's mathematicians developed new techniques for calculation and measurement that were essential for architecture, trade, and administration. They created sophisticated accounting systems that allowed Mali's government to track tax revenues and expenditures across the vast empire. They even developed early forms of statistical analysis that helped predict crop yields and plan for economic fluctuations. Perhaps most remarkably, Timbuktu's historians began creating detailed chronicles of African civilization that challenged Islamic and European assumptions about the continent. These scholars were among the first to systematically record African oral traditions, creating written histories that preserved knowledge about African societies that would have otherwise been lost. But it was in medicine where Sankor's scholars made perhaps their most important contributions. They combined Islamic medical knowledge with traditional African healing practices, creating treatments that were more effective than anything available in medieval Europe. Timbuktu's physicians performed cataract surgeries, set complex bone fractures, and even conducted early forms of psychological counseling that wouldn't appear in European medicine for centuries. The university's library eventually contained over 700,000 manuscripts, more books than existed in all of Europe at the time. But these weren't just religious texts or copies of ancient works. The collection included original research in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, philosophy, and history. It was quite literally one of the largest repositories of human knowledge in the medieval world. What Musa created in Timbuktu during the 1320s and 1330s was unprecedented in medieval Africa. A true intellectual revolution that transformed not just how knowledge was preserved, but how it was created and disseminated. The scholars at Sankore weren't just copying ancient texts. They were conducting original research, engaging in scholarly debates, and creating new works that synthesized Islamic scholarship with African traditional knowledge and empirical observation. Take, for example, the work of Ahmad Baba, one of Sankor's most famous scholars. Ahmad Baba didn't just study Islamic law, he developed new legal principles that addressed the specific challenges of governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire like Mali. His legal writings were so influential that they were studied in law schools from Morocco to Egypt. Or consider the astronomical work of Mahmoud Kati, who created star charts that were used by navigators throughout the Sahara. Kati's maps of the night sky were so accurate that they remained the standard reference for desert navigation for over 2 centuries. But perhaps most importantly, Timbuktu became a center for the production and trade of books themselves. The city's scribes and bookbinders created manuscripts that were works of art as well as scholarship, illuminated with gold ink and bound in fine leather that was traded across the Sahara. The book trade became one of Timbuktu's most profitable industries. A single high-quality manuscript could sell for the equivalent of several $1,000s in today's money. Wealthy families across West Africa would commission custom books the way modern collectors might commission artwork. But this intellectual revolution came with a price that Musa couldn't have anticipated. By 1330, Timbuktu had achieved everything that Mansa Musa had dreamed of. The city was wealthy, intellectually sophisticated, and internationally famous. European maps began showing Mali for the first time, usually depicted as a figure of a king holding a golden orb, with inscriptions describing the incredible wealth of the Africa interior. But fame could be dangerous. Portuguese explorers, funded by Prince Henry the Navigator, began systematic exploration of the West African coast, clearly searching for a sea route to Mali's gold mines that would bypass the Trans-Saharan trade routes controlled by North African and Arab merchants. The Portuguese weren't just interested in trade, they were gathering intelligence. Their exploration missions included geographers, linguists, and even anthropologists who were systematically studying African societies and looking for potential weaknesses that could be exploited. More ominously, the Ottoman Empire began expanding into North Africa, threatening the northern terminals of the trade routes that were the foundation of Mali's prosperity. The Ottomans weren't content to simply control trade. They wanted to control the sources of African gold directly. The Moroccans, seeing an opportunity to position themselves as intermediaries between European demand for gold and African supply, began consolidating their power in preparation for eventual expansion southward across the Sahara. But perhaps most dangerous of all, Mali's success had attracted the attention of rival African powers. The Songhai people, who had been vassals of Mali for over a century, were beginning to assert their independence under ambitious leaders who saw opportunity in challenging Mali's regional dominance. Musa understood that Mali's wealth had made it a target, but he also understood that the empire's only defense was to become even more sophisticated, even more advanced, even more indispensable to the medieval world economy. Here's the tragic irony that Mansa Musa couldn't have foreseen. Every step he took to strengthen Mali and protect it from external threats also made the empire more vulnerable to internal collapse. The massive construction projects in Timbuktu required enormous expenditures that strained even Mali's gold reserves. The recruitment of foreign scholars and craftsmen created a class of educated elites who had loyalties that extended beyond Mali's borders. The integration of Mali into international trade networks made the empire dependent on economic forces that no single ruler could control. Most critically, Musa's success in creating a sophisticated, centralized state had made Mali dependent on continued strong leadership. The administrative systems he had created were so complex that they required constant attention from the emperor himself. The diplomatic relationships he had built were personal connections that might not survive his death. By 1337, when Musa died after ruling for 25 years, he had created an empire that was simultaneously the most advanced civilization in medieval Africa and one of the most vulnerable to disruption. If you're still here, this story is about to take a darker turn, because what Musa's successors discovered was that building a golden age is far easier than maintaining one. The forces that Musa had set in motion, the international attention, the economic dependencies, the political complexities, were about to tear Mali apart from the inside. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you how even the most powerful empire in history can crumble when it faces enemies it never saw coming. By 1340, less than 3 years after Mansa Musa's death, the Mali Empire was beginning to fracture. But what finally destroyed Timbuktu wasn't gradual decline or economic pressure. It was a single devastating betrayal that came from the one place Musa's successors never thought to look. And when that betrayal was finally revealed, it would not only end Mali's golden age, but ensure that this incredible civilization would be erased from history for centuries. Mansa Musa's death in 1337 created a power vacuum that would expose the fundamental weakness of even the most sophisticated medieval empire: the problem of succession. Despite Mali's advanced administrative systems, the empire was still ultimately dependent on the personal authority and vision of its ruler. Musa was succeeded by his son Magan, but the transition revealed cracks in the imperial system that had been hidden by Musa's extraordinary leadership. Magan was intelligent and well-educated, but he lacked his father's political genius and, more critically, his international reputation. The governors of Mali's distant provinces, who had served loyally under Musa, began to test the limits of the new emperor's authority. Tax collection became irregular. Trade disputes that Musa would have resolved with a single decree began to fester into major conflicts. Most ominously, the careful balance between local autonomy and central control that had been the foundation of Mali's success began to break down. But the real crisis was economic. Musa's lavish spending during his Hajj, combined with the massive construction projects in Timbuktu, had actually strained even Mali's enormous gold reserves. The empire that had seemed infinitely wealthy was discovering that even the richest gold mines could be exhausted if not managed carefully. Mahan attempted to maintain his father's policies, but without Musa's personal relationships with international merchants and rulers, Mali found itself increasingly isolated from the global networks that had been the source of much of its prosperity. The situation worsened when Magan died after ruling for only 4 years, in 1341. He was succeeded by his uncle, Suleiman, who was more capable than Magan, but inherited an empire that was already showing signs of internal stress. By the 1350s, the geopolitical situation around Mali had fundamentally changed, largely as a result of Musa's own success in advertising the empire's wealth. The revelation of Mali's riches had set in motion forces that no single African ruler could control. European explorers were no longer content to trade with North African intermediaries. They wanted direct access to the source of Africa's gold. The Portuguese had established trading posts along the West African coast and were offering Mali's southern provinces direct trade relationships that bypassed Timbuktu entirely. This wasn't just economic competition. It was an existential threat to the Trans-Saharan trade networks that were the foundation of Mali's power. When gold could be shipped directly from West African ports to European markets, why would anyone bother with the expensive, dangerous journey across the Sahara? The Portuguese were also systematically mapping the African coast, gathering intelligence about local political systems, and identifying potential allies who might be willing to challenge Mali's regional dominance. They had begun establishing relationships with coastal kingdoms that had previously been Mali's vassals or trading partners. Meanwhile, the Moroccan Marinid dynasty was consolidating control over the northern terminals of the Saharan trade routes, positioning themselves to eventually challenge Mali's control over the gold trade directly. The Moroccans had learned from Musa's example. They understood that controlling African gold was the key to medieval wealth and power. Most dangerous of all, the Songhai people, who had been vassals of Mali for over a century, were beginning to assert their independence under the leadership of ambitious princes who saw opportunity in Mali's apparent weakness. The Songhai had always been skilled warriors and traders, but they had accepted Mali's dominance because it brought them prosperity and protection. Now, with Mali distracted by succession crises and external pressures, Songhai leaders began to wonder whether they might be better off controlling their own destiny. The transformation of Songhai from loyal vassal to dangerous rival didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a carefully planned strategy that took advantage of Mali's internal weaknesses while building Songhai's own military and economic capabilities. The key figure in this transformation was Ali Ber, who became the Songhai king around 1464. Ali Ber had studied Mali's methods carefully. He understood that military conquest alone wasn't enough to build a lasting empire. Like Mansa Musa, he needed to combine military power with economic control and diplomatic sophistication. But Ali Ber had advantages that earlier Songhai leaders had lacked. By the mid-15th century, new military technologies were becoming available in West Africa. Portuguese traders were selling firearms to African rulers, and these weapons gave significant advantages to armies that knew how to use them effectively. More importantly, Ali Ber understood that Mali's strength had also become its weakness. The vast size of the empire made it difficult to defend. The complexity of its administrative systems made it vulnerable to disruption. The wealth of cities like Timbuktu made them attractive targets for conquest. Ali Ber began his challenge to Mali not with direct military confrontation, but with economic warfare. He started offering better terms to merchants who had traditionally traded through Timbuktu, encouraging them to use Songhai-controlled routes instead. He negotiated direct relationships with North African traders, bypassing Mali's diplomatic networks. Most cleverly, he began recruiting scholars and administrators who were dissatisfied with conditions in Mali. Many of the foreign experts that Mansa Musa had brought to Timbuktu had never fully integrated into Malian society. When Ali Ber offered them better positions and higher salaries in Songhai cities, many of them were willing to switch sides. But Mali's problems weren't just external. The empire was also experiencing internal decay that made it increasingly difficult to respond effectively to outside challenges. The administrative systems that Mansa Musa had created were sophisticated, but they required constant maintenance and adjustment. As the empire's revenues declined and its attention was divided between multiple threats, these systems began to break down. Tax collection became irregular and corrupt. Provincial governors, seeing the weakness of central authority, began keeping more tax revenue for themselves. Military units that hadn't been paid regularly began to lose discipline and effectiveness. Perhaps most critically, the intellectual networks that had made Timbuktu famous began to fragment. Scholars who couldn't find adequate support in Mali began moving to other centers of learning. Libraries that had been maintained for centuries began to deteriorate as funding dried up. The University of Sankore, which had been the crown jewel of Musa's cultural achievements, began to lose its international reputation. Students who might once have traveled from across the Islamic world to study in Timbuktu began choosing universities in Cairo, Cordoba, or Baghdad instead. This intellectual decline had practical consequences. Mali's government had depended on university-trained administrators to manage the empire's complex systems. As the quality of education declined, the quality of administration declined as well. By 1400, Mali was trapped in a vicious cycle. Economic problems led to reduced investment in education, in infrastructure, which led to less effective administration, which led to more serious economic problems. By the early 1400s, perceptive observers could see that Mali's golden age was ending. Ibn Battuta, who had visited Timbuktu during its height in the 1350s, wrote in his later years that the city had already begun to decline by the time of his visit. European merchants who had once competed fiercely for access to Mali's markets began to explore alternative sources of African gold. Portuguese explorers were reporting success in establishing direct trade relationships with coastal African kingdoms. Most ominously, the balance of military power in West Africa was shifting. Mali's armies, which had once been invincible, were now using weapons and tactics that were decades behind the latest developments. The empire's enemies had access to firearms, while Mali's military remained largely dependent on traditional weapons. But perhaps the most telling sign of Mali's decline was demographic. Timbuktu's population, which had peaked at over 100,000 during Musa's reign, had fallen to perhaps 50,000 by 1450. The scholars, merchants, and craftsmen who had made the city prosperous were leaving for opportunities elsewhere. By 1500, Mali had lost control of most of its eastern territories to Songhai, and Timbuktu itself was no longer under Malian rule. But the city's greatest treasures, its libraries, its scholars, its accumulated knowledge, were still intact. What no one could have predicted was that Mali's enemies had been planning something far more devastating than mere political conquest. They had been planning to erase Timbuktu's intellectual legacy entirely, and when their plan was finally executed, it would be so thorough that most of the world would forget that African civilization had ever achieved such heights. By the late 16th century, the political map of West Africa had been completely redrawn. Mali was a shadow of its former self, controlling only a small territory around its original heartland. Songhai had become the dominant power in the region, controlling Timbuktu and most of the Trans-Saharan trade routes. But in Morocco, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur was planning something unprecedented, a military expedition across the Sahara Desert designed not just to conquer territory, but to seize control of the African gold trade entirely. Al-Mansur's plan was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. He intended to march an army of 4,000 men, equipped with the latest European firearms, across 1,500 miles of desert to attack cities that most Moroccans had never seen. But this wasn't a reckless gamble. Al-Mansur had been planning this campaign for years, gathering intelligence about West African political systems, studying trade routes, and most importantly, recruiting local guides and allies who could help his forces navigate the challenges of desert warfare. The expedition that set out from Morocco in 1591 was unlike anything Africa had ever seen. Led by the Spanish eunuch Juder Pasha, the Moroccan force included not just soldiers, but interpreters, administrators, and specialists who had been trained to take over and manage the complex systems that kept West African cities functioning. But here's the shocking truth that most histories don't tell you. This wasn't a conquest driven by religious fervor or simple territorial ambition. It was a calculated economic strike designed to seize control of the gold trade that European demand had made more valuable than ever. The Moroccans had studied Mansa Musa's example carefully. They understood that whoever controlled Timbuktu and the other trading cities of the Niger Bend could potentially become as wealthy as the legendary emperor himself. When the Moroccan army finally reached Timbuktu in April 1591, they found a city that was still impressive, but no longer the impregnable fortress it had been during Mali's golden age. The Songhai forces defending the city were brave and determined, but they were fighting with traditional weapons against soldiers equipped with muskets and cannons. The outcome was inevitable, but the speed of the Moroccan victory shocked everyone involved. Timbuktu fell after less than a month of fighting. But what happened next was far more devastating than the military conquest itself. The Moroccan forces, led by Juder Pasha, weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were essentially the world's first corporate raiders, sent to literally steal an entire civilization's accumulated wealth and knowledge. When they entered Timbuktu, they began a systematic looting operation that targeted not just gold and trade goods, but the city's intellectual treasures as well. The libraries that had taken centuries to accumulate were ransacked. Manuscripts were destroyed or shipped back to Morocco as curiosities. But the real tragedy wasn't just the theft of Timbuktu's wealth. It was the destruction of its intellectual community. The scholars who had made the city famous were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. The University of Sankore was abandoned. The scholarly networks that had connected Timbuktu to the broader Islamic world were severed forever. Here's what makes the Moroccan conquest of Timbuktu particularly devastating. It wasn't followed by an attempt to maintain or rebuild the city's greatness. Instead, the Moroccans implemented a policy of systematic extraction designed to transfer as much wealth as possible back to Morocco. The sophisticated economic systems that had made Timbuktu prosperous were dismantled. The trade networks that had connected West Africa to the broader world were redirected to benefit Moroccan merchants. Most critically, the intellectual institutions that had made the city famous were allowed to decay and disappear. Over the following decades, Timbuktu's population declined from around 50,000 to perhaps 10,000. The city that had once rivaled Cairo and Baghdad became a provincial outpost in a Moroccan colonial empire. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to the historical record. The Moroccan conquest wasn't just a military defeat. It was followed by a systematic campaign to erase Timbuktu's intellectual legacy from historical memory. European colonial writers, arriving in West Africa centuries later, found a region that appeared to confirm their prejudices about African civilization. The great libraries were gone. The universities had disappeared. The architectural marvels had crumbled or been abandoned. These European observers, seeking to justify their own presence in Africa, deliberately ignored or minimized evidence of the region's sophisticated past. They dismissed accounts of Mansa Musa's wealth as myths. They portrayed Timbuktu as a primitive trading post that had never achieved genuine civilization. But here's the most shocking part of this story. The destruction of Mali and Timbuktu wasn't just a historical accident. It was followed by a deliberate campaign to erase this civilization from historical memory. The few surviving manuscripts from Timbuktu's libraries were hidden by local families, who understood that these books represented the last evidence of their ancestors' achievements. For over 400 years, these manuscripts were passed down secretly from generation to generation, hidden in private homes, buried in the desert, or concealed in remote villages. European historians, working from sources that had been filtered through centuries of colonial prejudice, created a narrative of African history that essentially ignored the achievements of medieval West African civilization. Mansa Musa became a footnote. Timbuktu was portrayed as a myth. The University of Sankore was forgotten entirely. This historical erasure was so complete that when European explorers rediscovered Timbuktu in the 19th century, they were shocked to find that the city actually existed. They had convinced themselves that it was merely a legend created by Arab storytellers. For over 400 years, one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history was essentially erased from the historical record, dismissed as myth or primitive tribal organization. It wasn't until the 1970s that historians began to piece together the true scope of Mali's achievements. The rediscovery of Timbuktu's manuscript collections revealed the existence of a sophisticated intellectual tradition that had been completely unknown to modern scholarship. Today, as we work to digitize and preserve these manuscripts, we're not just recovering historical documents. We're recovering an entire civilization that was deliberately forgotten. We're learning about African achievements in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval intellectual history. The story of Mansa Musa and Timbuktu isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder that entire civilizations can rise to extraordinary heights and then vanish from memory, not because they weren't remarkable, but because those who came after had reasons to forget them. The legacy of Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how history is written and who gets to tell the story of human civilization. For centuries, the achievements of medieval Africa were hidden, ignored, or dismissed as impossible. The wealth of Mansa Musa was treated as a fairy tale. The intellectual sophistication of Timbuktu was forgotten. The architectural marvels of Mali were allowed to crumble into dust. But the truth, as we're now discovering, is far more incredible than any fiction. Mali wasn't just wealthy, it was one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. Timbuktu wasn't just a trading post, it was a center of learning that rivaled Baghdad and Cordoba. Mansa Musa wasn't just a lucky king who found some gold. He was a visionary leader who created sustainable prosperity on a scale that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Today, as we rediscover the manuscripts of Timbuktu and piece together the true scope of Mali's achievements, we're not just learning about the past, we're recovering a vision of what human civilization is capable of achieving when knowledge, wealth, and wisdom are combined in service of something greater than mere conquest. Mansa Musa's empire fell, but his legacy endures in every library, every university, and every place where people gather to learn and grow together. The golden age of Mali reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, at any time, among any people. But it also warns us that even the most magnificent achievements can be lost if we don't work to preserve and protect them. If this story opened your eyes to a chapter of history you never knew existed, hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories that will change how you see the world. And let me know in the comments. What other lost civilizations do you think deserve to have their stories told? The truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it.